March the 3rd, 1943, Bismarck Sea, South Pacific. The ocean was strangely calm that morning, as if completely ignoring the fact that thousands of men were about to die there. On the deck of the Japanese destroyer Arashio, Commander Hideo Kuboki kept his eyes fixed on the horizon through his naval binoculars. He was an experienced officer, a man who had already been through violent night battles in the Solomon Islands, where Japanese destroyers raced in the darkness at over 30 knots to attack Allied ships. But that day the situation was different. His ship sailed slowly at only 7 knots, escorting a heavy transport convoy loaded with Imperial Army soldiers. The objective was simple and desperate at the same time: to get almost 7,000 men to Lae in New Guinea before the Americans could intercept them. For the Japanese High Command, that mission represented more than military reinforcements. It was an attempt to prevent the entire battlefront in New Guinea from collapsing. The ships advanced in 2 columns, escorted by heavily armed destroyers. On paper, it seemed a formidable force. 8 transports and 8 combat escorts, many of them veterans of the Guadalcanal campaign. On the transport decks, hundreds of soldiers sat atop ammunition crates or sacks of rice, gazing at the endless sea. Some smoked silently. Others held letters from their families. Many were exhausted after days sailing on overcrowded ships. Still, there was a certain relief in the air. The convoy had already survived an air raid the previous day. For many, this meant the worst was over. Only a few hours remained to reach their destination, a few more miles, and the ships would be under land-based Japanese air protection. Kuboki was watching the sea when he heard the cry no commander wants to hear in the middle of the ocean. "Aircraft!" The alert came from the lookout positioned above the ship's bridge. Several sailors immediately looked to the sky. It was almost a conditioned reflex. Planes always attacked from above. Heavy bombers descended from the clouds, dropped their bombs, and disappeared again into the heights. But at that moment, the sky was clear, blue, and empty. For a strange second, it seemed the lookout had been mistaken. Then, Kuboki slowly lowered his binoculars towards the southern horizon. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat for a moment. Small, dark dots moved rapidly across the ocean's surface. They weren't descending from the clouds. They were coming directly over the water, so low it looked as if their propellers were touching the spray of the waves. Kuboki adjusted the focus of his binoculars and finally managed to make out the silhouettes. American B-25 Mitchell bombers. Behind them, more aggressive planes with heavy noses and wide wings, Australian bow fighters. Those planes weren't descending to attack, they were already at attack altitude. This defied everything Japanese naval officers had learned about aerial warfare. Bombers were supposed to attack from thousands of meters high. That's what the manual said. That's how all previous battles had gone. But those planes were flying just meters above the water, advancing directly against the convoy as if the ocean were a runway. The radial engines of the B-25s produced a deep rumble that began to fill the air. Some Japanese sailors stood motionless for a few seconds, trying to comprehend what they were seeing. Others rushed to the anti-aircraft guns, trying to rotate the weapons downwards enough to hit the planes. It was at this moment that Kuboki realized the first real problem. Many of those guns simply couldn't lower enough to hit targets so low. The weapons had been designed to defend the ship from attacks from the sky, not from planes flying almost at wave height. It was like trying to aim a rifle at something crawling beneath your feet. Kuboki began issuing rapid orders, flag signals, orders over the internal radio, change of course, attempts to spread the convoy to hinder the attack. But there was another problem impossible to ignore. Those transports were slow, heavy, and full of troops. Maneuvering a convoy of that size was like trying to turn an entire city around in the middle of the ocean. Every second lost reduced the chances of survival. And there was still a question that no Japanese officer could answer at that moment. How had the Americans found that convoy in the middle of such a vast ocean? The Japanese plan had been carefully crafted to avoid aerial reconnaissance. The route passed north of New Britain, using mountains and tropical storms as natural cover. Even so, the Allied planes were there, in the exact place, at the exact time. As the planes approached, another detail began to catch the attention of the Japanese crews. Some B-25s had their noses completely modified. In place of the traditional bomber compartment, there were rows of 50-caliber heavy machine guns. This transformed each bomber into an extremely aggressive frontal assault platform. It was as if each plane were a flying destroyer, firing hundreds of projectiles per second at the decks of the ships. For the Japanese, this was unexpected and deeply worrying. Those planes weren't just carrying bombs. They were prepared to sweep away the anti-aircraft crews before even launching their attacks. Now the planes were so close that the pilots could be seen in the cockpits. Some Japanese sailors would later swear they managed to see the faces of the enemy planes for fractions of a second. Others would only remember the deafening roar of the first bursts of machine gun fire cutting through the air over the ocean. What no one in that convoy knew was that this tactic had been secretly developed over weeks. Those pilots weren't improvising. They were executing a plan rehearsed repeatedly in dangerous training exercises over the sea. A plan devised by an American general who believed that aerial warfare needed to change completely if the United States wanted to control the Pacific. But there is a fundamental question that still needs to be answered before the first bomb hits the water. Who was the man who had the courage or the madness to teach pilots to attack ships flying just meters above the ocean? Because the answer to that question begins hundreds of kilometers away, at an air base in New Guinea, where an American general was about to defy all the traditional rules of aerial warfare. And when he made that decision, the fate of that Japanese convoy was practically sealed. January 1943, Port Moresby Air Base, New Guinea. While the Japanese convoy hadn't even left the port of Rabaul yet, a group of American officers was already discussing a problem that was costing lives in the Pacific. 5th Air Force bombers flew missions against Japanese ships almost daily, but the results were frustrating. Bombs dropped from high altitudes rarely hit moving targets. It was like trying to hit a moving truck by throwing a rock from a 10-story building. Many pilots returned to base, knowing they had risked their lives without actually causing damage to the enemy. For men who had friends fighting on the islands, this was hard to accept. Each Japanese ship that arrived in New Guinea meant more soldiers facing American and Australian troops in the jungle. At the center of this discussion was General George C. Kenney, commander of the United States 5th Air Force in the Southwest Pacific. Kenney was no ordinary officer. He was known for ignoring rules that didn't work on the battlefield. Before the war, he already argued that airplanes could dominate the ocean if used differently. Many traditional officers disliked these ideas. For them, warships should dominate the sea. Airplanes should only provide support. But Kenney saw war differently. He believed that technology and creativity could completely change the balance between ships and aircraft. On a hot afternoon in Port Moresby, Kenney called together some pilots and engineers to discuss an old idea. He asked something that seemed simple. What if we don't attack from above? Some officers were puzzled. Bombers always attacked from above. That's how the manuals taught it. That's how military academies trained pilots. But Kenney wanted something different. He wanted the bombers to attack almost at water level. The idea seemed absurd. Flying so low would put the planes directly within range of the ship's anti-aircraft guns. A single shot could destroy an aircraft. But Kenney believed there was a hidden advantage there. If the bombs were dropped too close to the surface of the sea, they could ricochet off the water and hit the ship's hull exactly where it was most vulnerable. To turn that theory into reality, Kenney needed someone who thought like a mechanic, not a bureaucrat. That man was Major Paul "Pappy" Gunn. Gunn was unlike almost any other Air Force officer. Before the war, he had been a civilian pilot in the Philippines. When the Japanese invaded the region, his family ended up imprisoned in an internment camp. That completely changed his perspective on the conflict. Gunn didn't just want to win battles. He wanted to find ways to quickly destroy any Japanese ship that appeared in the Pacific. Gunn began working on the B-25 Mitchell bombers stationed at the base. The B-25 was a robust aircraft, with 2 radial engines and a large payload capacity. It had already become famous a few months earlier in the Doolittle raid on Tokyo. But Gunn believed that this aircraft could do much more. Instead of using it only as a bomber, he decided to transform it into something much more aggressive. He removed the bomber bay at the front of the aircraft and installed several 50-caliber machine guns pointed directly forward. Then he added more weapons to the sides of the fuselage. The result was impressive. When a B-25 fired all its weapons at once, it looked like a fire hose shooting through the air. Some pilots who saw the first prototype were incredulous. One of them commented that the plane looked like a truck full of weapons flying at low altitude. Kenny, seeing the modification, smiled and gave a simple order: put even more weapons on it. He wanted the planes to be able to completely sweep the deck of a ship before even dropping bombs. The logic was clear. If the anti-aircraft guns were silenced in the first few seconds, the bombers would have a better chance of surviving the attack. For weeks, pilots trained over the ocean near New Guinea. They flew so low that sometimes the sea spray hit the cockpit window. Some pilots compared the sensation to driving a car very fast on a narrow road, knowing that any mistake could be fatal. Yet something began to change during these training exercises. Bombs dropped at low altitude actually ricocheted off the water before hitting their target. And when they struck a ship's hull, the impact was devastating. For many pilots, this seemed like a solution to a problem that had frustrated them for months. While these training exercises were taking place, American intelligence was working quietly elsewhere. Specialists were deciphering intercepted Japanese communications in the Pacific. Among these messages were details about convoy movements and military reinforcements. This is how the first clues emerged that a large troop transport was being prepared in Rabaul. For the American and Australian soldiers fighting in New Guinea, this news was alarming. A convoy full of Japanese reinforcements could prolong the war in that region for a long time. Kenny immediately understood what this meant. This would be the perfect opportunity to test the new tactic in real combat. It wouldn't just be an attack against an isolated ship, it would be an attack against an entire formation. A definitive test to see if aircraft could truly destroy a fleet escorted by armed destroyers. At the airbase, the pilots began preparing their aircraft. Some wrote quick letters home before bed. Others discussed the mission while checking weapons and engines. For many of them, the feeling was similar to that of a soldier preparing for a dangerous patrol. There was tension, but there was also confidence. They believed they were about to attempt something that could change the war in the Pacific. But there was one question that no one could answer for sure. Would this new tactic work against a well-defended Japanese fleet, or would the bombers flying so low simply be shot down before getting close enough to drop their bombs? While these doubts circulated among the American pilots, the Japanese convoy sailed slowly through the Bismarck Sea, believing it had escaped enemy detection. On the decks of the ships, soldiers rested, chatted, and watched the horizon, unaware that they were being searched for at that very moment by Allied reconnaissance planes. And somewhere above the clouds, an American pilot was about to look down and see something that would completely change the fate of that convoy. Because when that pilot spotted the ships in the ocean, the new attack tactic would finally cease to be just an experiment. It would become a real weapon of war. March 1st, 1943. Sky over the Bismarck Sea, Southwest Pacific. Lieutenant Walter Higgins was piloting a B-24 Liberator bomber on a mission that, in theory, was routine. Fly high, observe the ocean, and return with any useful information. Missions like this rarely made history, but that day something caught his eye through the aircraft's side window. First, he saw a line of smoke on the horizon, then small shadows moving slowly over the sea. Higgins asked the co-pilot to adjust the plane's heading and began counting the dark dots below. 1, 2, 5, 8 transports. Then escort destroyers. It was exactly the type of target the 5th Air Force pilots had been expecting for weeks. An entire convoy sailing exposed in the middle of the ocean. Higgins immediately picked up the radio and transmitted the message that would change the fate of thousands of men in that sea. Large Japanese convoy located. But there was something curious about that moment. The pilot knew he wasn't just finding ships. He was, in practice, delivering a real test for the new tactic that had been prepared in Port Moresby. That message crossing the radio wasn't just a military report. It was the green light to put into practice an idea that many officers still considered too risky. And here, an important question arises. How many times does a war change because someone simply looked out the window of an airplane at the right moment? The news quickly reached 5th Air Force headquarters. Maps were spread out on planning tables. Officers began calculating distances, fuel, and flight time. General George Kenney watched everything in silence. He knew that this opportunity might not come again. A convoy of that size didn't sail without protection, but at that moment it was too far away to receive constant air cover from Japan. Kenney ordered all available units to prepare. B-17 and B-24 heavy bombers would be used for the first high-altitude attacks. Then would come the B-25s modified for the new type of low-altitude attack. The strategy was simple: confuse, pressure, and finally, destroy. The following day, March 2nd, the first blow was struck. Formations of B-17 Flying Fortress bombers appeared in the sky more than 6,000 meters high. For the Japanese sailors, this was a familiar scene. Heavy bombers were large, noisy, and relatively predictable. Bombs began to fall into the ocean around the convoy, raising enormous columns of water. Most missed the ships, just as had happened in many previous attacks. But the mathematics of war works relentlessly. When dozens of bombs are dropped, some end up finding their target. A Japanese transport was hit directly and began to sink rapidly, scattering soldiers and wreckage across the sea. Here arises another question that many American veterans would ask years later. What happens to a convoy when it realizes it is being followed and continuously attacked from the sky? The answer is not simple. Some commanders accelerate. Others try to disperse the formations. In the case of that Japanese convoy, the decision was to remain together. For the Japanese officers, maintaining formation was the only way to guarantee mutual protection against air and submarine attacks. During the night, the ships continued sailing slowly toward New Guinea. Some destroyers picked up survivors from the transport sunk in the previous attack. More than 600 men were pulled from the water and placed aboard one of the escort ships. That humanitarian decision seemed right at the time. No commander would let his own soldiers die at sea if he could save them, but there was a tactical consequence that no one could ignore. The destroyer was now overcrowded, heavier, and less maneuverable. Meanwhile, in Port Moresby, the American pilots reviewed maps and discussed the next day's mission. Many of them had never performed skip bombing attacks in real combat. Some compared the maneuver to throwing a stone into a lake, trying to make it skip several times before hitting a target. The difference was that here the stone weighed almost 500 kilograms, and the target was shooting back. One pilot commented during the briefing that flying so low against armed ships felt like driving a car at high speed straight into a wall, hoping the wall will move. Even so, no one backed down. Here's an interesting point to consider. In many wars, victory doesn't belong solely to the side with more weapons or more men. Often it belongs to the side that adapts first. And at that moment, the American pilots were about to test exactly that. In the early morning of March 3rd, the engines began to start on the makeshift runways of New Guinea. B-25 medium bombers, escort fighters, and Australian Beaufighter aircraft were lined up for takeoff. Technicians checked each machine gun and each bomb. The atmosphere at the base was a mixture of tension and anticipation. Some pilots drank coffee in silence before boarding their aircraft. Others made short jokes to ease the pressure. It was a common ritual among men who knew they might not return. As the planes took off toward the Bismarck Sea, the Japanese convoy continued sailing slowly toward its destination. Most of the soldiers on board still believed that the worst was over after the previous day's attack. They didn't know that hundreds of kilometers away, dozens of planes were flying directly toward them, prepared to execute a tactic that almost no one in the world had ever seen before. And here arises the question that begins to define the fate of that battle. What happens when bombers stop attacking from the sky and start attacking as if they were torpedo bombers, flying just a few meters above the water? Because when the first Allied planes appear on the horizon on that clear March morning, the Japanese commanders will have only a few seconds to understand something that would completely change the war in the Pacific. The sun had already risen completely when the first Allied planes began to approach the Bismarck Sea. Inside the cockpits of the B-25 Mitchells, the pilots kept their eyes fixed on the horizon, while the radial engines roared steadily. The plane vibrated slightly with the turbulence near the water's surface. For many of those men, this was not just another bombing mission. They were about to execute a maneuver that, until a few months before, had been considered too risky for actual combat. Now, however, that technique was seen as the best chance to prevent thousands of Japanese soldiers from reinforcing the war in New Guinea. The American pilots had received very clear instructions: approach at high speed around 350 kilometers per hour, maintain an extremely low altitude, attack first with machine guns to neutralize the anti-aircraft weapons, then release the bombs at the exact moment so that they would ricochet off the water before hitting the hulls of the ships. It was a procedure that required nerves of steel. A second of error could mean hitting the water with the plane or entering directly into the firing range of enemy cannons. Still, there was confidence within the cockpits. Many of those pilots had trained for weeks, flying just meters above the ocean. Now finally, they would have the chance to prove that this idea really worked. Meanwhile, on the Japanese convoy, the morning seemed relatively calm. Some sailors watched the sky, while others worked on the ship's decks. The destroyers maintained positions around the transports like guard dogs, ready to react to any threat. Many soldiers who had spent the night on deck were now trying to rest. Some chatted in small groups, others simply watched the sea. The war seemed distant for a few moments, but that feeling of security would last very little. The first Allied planes to appear weren't bombers. They were Australian Beaufighters, flying incredibly low over the sea. These planes were heavy and aggressive, equipped with 4 20mm cannons and several machine guns. When they began their attack, the sound of gunfire echoed over the water like a storm of metal. Bursts of gunfire pierced the decks of Japanese ships, hitting anti-aircraft positions before many gunners could even react. Some sailors tried to run for their weapons, but were surprised by the intensity of the attack. That first pass of the Beaufighters wasn't just an attack. It was a way to clear the way for the bombers that were coming right behind. Soon after, the B-25 Mitchells appeared. To those observing from the decks of the Japanese ships, it seemed impossible to believe what they were seeing. Medium bombers, flying almost at wave level, advancing directly against the fleet. Some gunners tried to adjust their cannons downwards, but the speed of the planes made aiming extremely difficult. Inside the cockpit of one of the B-25s, the pilot lined up the first target. A large troop transport appeared clearly ahead. The pilot kept the plane steady while the navigator counted the distance to the target. 600 yards, 500, 400. The machine guns began firing, sweeping the ship's deck with heavy-caliber projectiles. When the moment was right, the pilot pressed the bomb release command. 2 500-pound projectiles fell from the plane and hit the water just ahead of the ship. For a fraction of a second it seemed they would simply sink. But then exactly what the engineers had predicted during testing happened. The bombs ricocheted off the surface of the sea, like stones skipping across a lake, and struck the hull of the transport. The ensuing explosion was devastating. Columns of smoke and debris rose into the air as the ship began to list to one side. Other B-25s followed the same attack pattern. Each plane chose a different target within the Japanese formation. Within minutes, several ships were ablaze or severely damaged. Some destroyers attempted to maneuver to protect the transports, positioning themselves between the planes and the larger ships. It was a courageous reaction, typical of the discipline of the Japanese Navy. But the speed and proximity of the attacks made any defense extremely difficult. American pilots would recall years later the intensity of those minutes. One of them wrote in his diary that the attack seemed to happen in slow motion inside the cockpit, while in the real world everything moved with frightening speed. Another pilot commented that he could see sailors running across the decks of ships as he lined up the attack. This kind of proximity made aerial combat much more personal than high-altitude bombing. Later statistics would reveal something impressive. In less than 20 minutes of combat, several Japanese transports were already sinking or out of control. For comparison, previous attacks carried out from high altitude often required dozens of missions to inflict similar damage. That difference made it clear to Allied commanders that the new tactic was working far better than any previous strategy. As the attacks continued, a second wave of Allied aircraft began arriving in the battle area. B-17 heavy bombers resumed dropping bombs from altitude, further increasing the chaos within the Japanese formation. The sea began to fill with debris, oil, and smoke. Some ships attempted to rescue survivors, while others struggled to keep their engines running. It was a scene that mixed military discipline, despair, and confusion. For the American pilots participating in that operation, there was also a different feeling growing inside the cockpits. Many realized they were witnessing something that could change the war in the Pacific. That combination of low-altitude attack, strafing, and precise bombing was demonstrating that land-based aircraft could destroy entire convoys at sea. And yet, the battle was far from over, because while some ships were already sinking, others remained operational, and new Allied aircraft continued to arrive on the battlefield. What was happening at that moment was only the first phase of an attack that would become one of the most decisive episodes of the air war in the Pacific. And in the next few hours, the fate of that Japanese convoy would be definitively sealed. The first few minutes of the attack had plunged the Japanese convoy into confusion, but the battle was far from over. In the sky above the Bismarck Sea, the engines of Allied aircraft continued to appear on the horizon in successive waves. For the men on the Japanese ships, time seemed distorted. Some minutes felt like hours. Explosions, bursts of machine gun fire, and the roar of the engines mingled into a single constant sound that echoed across the ocean. Inside a B-25 Mitchell returning for another attack pass, the pilot kept the plane extremely low, almost touching the water's surface. The altimeter indicated just over 15 meters of altitude. The cockpit vibrated as the plane accelerated toward another target. That proximity to the sea demanded total concentration. Any higher wave or gust of wind could destabilize the aircraft. Still, the pilots knew that this was precisely the advantage they possessed. By flying so low, they drastically reduced the reaction time of enemy anti-aircraft guns. Below them, the scene was already dramatic. One of the large Japanese transports was completely engulfed in black smoke. Another had stopped moving and was beginning to slowly tilt to one side. Men ran across the deck trying to fight fires or help the wounded. On a nearby destroyer, sailors tried to reorganize the anti-aircraft guns while watching American planes returning for another attack. Even under extreme pressure, many Japanese officers maintained admirable discipline. Destroyers began maneuvering at high speed, trying to create a barrier between the planes and the transport ships. It was an attempt to protect the soldiers on board. When the next group of B-25s dove for the attack, the Japanese gunners finally managed to open fire more intensely. Red tracers began to rise from the sea towards the planes. Some shots passed dangerously close to the American fuselages. Inside the cockpit, the pilots could clearly see the explosions of the projectiles all around. A navigator shouted through the intercom warning of anti-aircraft fire coming from the left. The pilots slightly adjusted the course, keeping the target in the center of the display. Once again, the pattern of attack repeated itself. First, the 50-caliber machine guns fired intense bursts at the ship's deck. Projectiles pierced equipment, antennas, and firing positions. Then, the pilot released the bombs at the calculated moment. They hit the water, bounced once, and went directly towards the destroyer's hull. The explosion raised a huge column of water and metal, hitting the ship's structure just below the waterline. The impact was enough to completely stop the vessel. Meanwhile, heavy bombers continued attacking from higher altitudes. Bombs fell around the convoy, some missing their targets by only a few meters. Even when they didn't directly hit the ships, the explosions created shockwaves that further disrupted the Japanese formation. The sea was now covered in oil slicks, pieces of wood, and smoke. In some places, soldiers could be seen in the water trying to reach wreckage that could serve as footholds. One of the American pilots would recall years later that that sight was one of the hardest images to forget. In his cockpit, he was focused on the mission, but glancing quickly down, he saw groups of men trying to swim among the wreckage. For many aviators, that moment represented the brutal contrast of war. They were there to fulfill a military mission, to prevent Japanese reinforcements from reaching the battlefield, but at the same time, they knew that each explosion meant lives lost in the ocean. Despite this, the attack needed to continue. More planes arrived and carried out further strafing and bombing runs. A Japanese transport ship that was still trying to maintain speed was hit again and began to sink rapidly. Another ship suffered severe damage and completely lost its maneuverability. The remaining destroyers tried to pick up survivors, while also struggling to keep their own defenses functioning. The numbers from the battle were becoming clear even before the fighting ended. In a short period of time, most of the Japanese convoy had been destroyed or incapacitated. This was something few military strategists would have considered possible just a few months earlier. A land-based air force had managed to disrupt and virtually eliminate an entire naval formation on the high seas. For the American pilots returning to their bases after the first attacks, the silence inside the cockpits was unusual. Many knew they had participated in something that would likely go down in the history of aerial warfare. The concept of low-altitude attacks had ceased to be merely an experimental theory. Now there was concrete proof that this strategy could destroy ships quickly and efficiently. While the planes temporarily withdrew from the combat area, the Bismarck Sea remained marked by columns of smoke and damaged ships. Some Japanese destroyers were still attempting to rescue men from the water, even knowing that new attacks could happen at any moment. The day's battle was approaching its decisive moment. And in the following hours, when the final phase of the Allied attack took place, it would become perfectly clear that the Japanese convoy would not reach its destination. What had begun as a military reinforcement operation would turn into one of the greatest logistical defeats faced by Japan during the entire war in the Pacific. The engines of the Allied planes began to disappear on the horizon, but the Bismarck Sea still seemed to be at war. The surface of the water was covered with oil slicks, wooden debris, pieces of metal, and dark smoke that slowly rose into the sky. Some Japanese ships still struggled to stay afloat, while others were already listing irreversibly, doomed to disappear into the depths of the Pacific. For the men who were still on board, the next few minutes would be decisive. Some tried to put out fires, others tried to help wounded comrades. Many simply looked to the sky, fearing that the planes would return. On the destroyers that remained operational, commanders faced impossible decisions. The discipline of the Japanese Navy demanded that ships protect the convoy and rescue survivors. But every minute idle in that sea also increased the risk of further air attacks. Some destroyers began to collect men floating among the wreckage. Sailors stretched ropes and nets, pulling exhausted soldiers onto the deck. Many of these men had survived the explosion of their ships, only to now face the vastness of the ocean. For those in the water, the scene was almost surreal. The smell of burnt fuel dominated the air. Fragments of crates, drums, and pieces of hull served as makeshift supports. Some soldiers tried to swim towards the ships that were still rescuing survivors. Others simply clung to wreckage, hoping someone would find them. Warfare at sea has a cruel characteristic. When a ship sinks, the battle doesn't end immediately for those who survive the explosion. Meanwhile, many miles away, American pilots were returning to their bases in New Guinea. Inside the cockpits, some men were still processing what they had seen. During the attack, everything had happened too fast for reflection. Now, in the silence of the return flight, some images came back to mind more clearly. Columns of smoke rising from the ships. Explosions near the water, men running across the deck. One pilot would later write in a letter that the battle seemed like a huge military exercise at first, until he realized that each ship that sank took hundreds of people with it. Nevertheless, the numbers from the battle were impossible to ignore. That operation had destroyed most of a large Japanese convoy carrying thousands of soldiers. For Allied strategists, this meant something very important. Without these reinforcements, Japanese forces in New Guinea would be isolated and much more vulnerable to American and Australian advances. In military terms, the impact of that battle was profound. It demonstrated that land-based aircraft could control entire sea lanes, something that many analysts still doubted at the beginning of the war. But perhaps the most significant change was in the realm of military ideas. Until then, many commanders still believed that large surface fleets would dominate the oceans. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea showed something different. It showed that fast, well-trained aircraft equipped with new tactics could destroy entire convoys in a few hours. This would transform how navies and air forces planned their operations in the years to come. For many American veterans who participated in the mission, that day represented a turning point. Not only because they had managed to stop a major Japanese reinforcement, but because they had proven that creativity and adaptation could change the course of the war. The idea of attacking ships flying just a few meters above the water seemed risky at first. Some called it madness, but on that day it proved extremely effective. Decades later, military historians would continue to study that battle as a clear example of innovation in combat. It demonstrated how decisions made by pilots, engineers, and commanders at makeshift bases in the Pacific could influence entire campaigns. And for many Americans who lived through that time, the battle also symbolized something greater: the adaptability of Allied forces in the face of unexpected challenges. Today, the Bismarck Sea is silent again. Fishing vessels cross those waters, unaware that beneath the surface lie the wreckage of a battle that changed the course of warfare in the Pacific. For those who study military history, this episode remains a powerful reminder that the outcome of a war often depends not only on who has the most resources, but on who can think differently at the right time. And stories like this continue to be told because they help us understand how human decisions, courage, and innovation have shaped the world we live in today. If you've made it this far, it means you also value true stories from military history. So take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and leave a comment telling us what you thought of this battle, or sharing any experiences or interesting facts about the history of World War II. Your participation helps keep these stories alive and allows more people to learn about decisive moments like this one.